Sometimes life puts us through paths of humiliation to prepare us for a greater destiny. In that luxury house in Richmond, I was invisible to everyone except him. Hello, my dear ones. I'm Rose. I'm 78 years old today, and my heart is full of stories to tell. Before I start this story that completely changed my life, I want to ask you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It's a joy to know that my stories reach so many different places. I'm going to tell you today how I went from poverty and humiliation to find true love when everything seemed lost. This story begins in 1965, when I was just 18 years old, working as a housekeeper for the Henderson family here in Richmond, Virginia. Dr. William Henderson was the most respected physician in town, married to Margaret, a woman who wore her social status like armor. Their house on Monument Avenue was a testament to Southern elegance: white columns, manicured gardens, and enough rooms to house 3 families. I had been working there for 6 months, cleaning, cooking, and trying to remain invisible as my grandmother had taught me. "Rose," she used to say, "when you work for wealthy folks, you keep your eyes down and your mouth shut. But sometimes life has other plans for us." Dr. Henderson was different from other employers I'd had. He noticed when I reorganized his medical books, complimented my cooking, and always said, "Please," and "Thank you." Small gestures that meant the world to a girl who had grown up being treated like furniture. His wife Margaret, however, made it clear from day one that I was beneath her notice. She would inspect my work with white gloves, literally, and had a way of making me feel smaller than the dust I cleaned from her precious antiques. That particular week in October, Mrs. Henderson had traveled to Atlanta to visit her sister, leaving the doctor alone in that big house. I remember the crisp autumn air, the leaves turning golden outside the kitchen window where I prepared his simple dinner. He had been working late at the hospital, as usual, and when he came home that Tuesday evening, he looked exhausted. "Rose," he said, loosening his tie, "would you mind joining me for dinner tonight? I hate eating alone in that dining room." The request surprised me, but I saw nothing improper in it. After all, he was a gentleman, a pillar of the community, and I was just grateful for steady employment. The dining room felt different that night. Dr. Henderson had lit candles, opened a bottle of wine, and insisted I sit across from him, at the mahogany table where I usually only dusted. He asked about my family, my dreams, listened intently as I told him about my mother who cleaned offices downtown, and my younger sister still in high school. For the first time in my life, I felt seen, heard, important. The wine made me bold. His attention made me feel beautiful. And when he told me I had the most genuine smile he'd ever seen, something inside me fluttered like a trapped bird. "You're so different from the girls I knew growing up," he said, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "There's something pure about you, Rose. Something real." His words were honey to a girl who had never been told she was special. When he suggested we move to the living room, when he poured another glass of wine, when he sat close to me on the velvet sofa, I felt like Cinderella at the ball. I had read enough romance novels borrowed from the library to recognize the signs, to believe that maybe, just maybe, this successful, handsome man could see something in me worth loving. The evening grew later, the candles burned lower, and Dr. Henderson's compliments became more intimate. "You're beautiful, Rose, more beautiful than you know." When he kissed me, I thought of all the fairy tales where the poor girl wins the prince's heart. I was 18, naive, and desperately wanting to believe that love could bridge any gap between social classes. In that candlelit room, surrounded by luxury I could never afford, I made a decision that would change my life forever. I gave myself to him completely, believing in his whispered promises, trusting in his gentle touch, certain that this was the beginning of something beautiful. But morning has a way of washing away the magic of candlelight. When I woke up in his guest room the next day, Dr. Henderson was already dressed for work, adjusting his tie in the mirror with practiced efficiency. "Rose," he said without meeting my eyes, "what happened last night? It can't happen again. You understand, don't you? I'm a married man with a reputation to protect." The coldness in his voice hit me like ice water. Gone was the tender man who had called me beautiful, replaced by someone who looked at me like I was a mistake that needed to be cleaned up. "But you said—" I started, wrapping the sheet around myself, suddenly ashamed of my nakedness in the harsh morning light. "You said I was special." He turned then, and for a moment I saw something like regret in his eyes before it hardened into resolve. "You are special, Rose. That's why I know you'll understand that this was just a moment of weakness. We're from different worlds. Surely you can see that." His words cut deeper than any physical wound. In one night, I had gone from feeling like a princess to being reminded that I was just the help. I dressed quickly, my hands shaking as I buttoned my uniform. Dr. Henderson had already left for the hospital by the time I made it to the kitchen, leaving a $50 bill on the counter with a note. "Thank you for your understanding. Please don't mention this to anyone." $50, more money than I'd ever held at once, but it felt like payment for services rendered rather than a gesture of affection. I spent that day mechanically performing my duties, replaying every moment of the previous evening, trying to understand how I had misread the situation so completely. When Mrs. Henderson returned from Atlanta 3 days later, life resumed its normal rhythm. She inspected my work with her usual critical eye, complained about the way I had arranged the flowers, and never suspected that her marriage bed had been defiled in her absence. Dr. Henderson avoided being alone with me, communicating through brief professional nods when our paths crossed. I felt like I was drowning in shame and confusion, but I kept working, kept cleaning, kept pretending that nothing had changed while everything inside me felt broken. 2 months later, when my monthly cycle failed to arrive for the second time, I knew with devastating certainty that my life had taken an irreversible turn. The morning sickness started gradually, just a queasy feeling when I smelled bacon cooking, a sudden aversion to coffee that I had always loved. But as the weeks passed, there was no denying what was happening to my body. I was carrying Dr. Henderson's child, and I had no idea how to face the storm that was coming. I remember standing in the bathroom of that grand house, staring at my reflection in the ornate mirror, trying to see the changes that I felt so acutely. My face looked the same, but everything else was different. I was no longer just Rose, the housekeeper from the wrong side of town. I was Rose, the unwed mother carrying her employer's illegitimate child. In 1965, Richmond, that was a scandal that could destroy lives, and I had no doubt about whose life would be considered expendable. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had to continue cleaning the house where my child had been conceived, serving meals to the woman whose husband had fathered my baby, all while hiding the secret that grew larger inside me each day. Every morning when I put on my uniform, every time I polished the silver or dusted the bookshelves, I wondered how long I could maintain this charade. Dr. Henderson had made it clear that our night together was forgotten. But some things cannot be forgotten, cannot be hidden forever. As my body began to change in ways that would soon become obvious, I knew I was living on borrowed time. The respectable world of Monument Avenue had no place for girls like me, pregnant and unmarried. I had seen what happened to other young women in my situation, ostracized by their families, fired from their jobs, forced to disappear until their shame could be properly hidden away. But I also knew something that gave me strength. I was carrying new life, and no matter how this child came to be, I would protect and love them with everything I had. The morning that would change everything arrived on a cold February day. I was in the kitchen trying to keep down some dry toast when Mrs. Henderson's sharp voice cut through the quiet. "Rose, come to the living room immediately." Something in her tone made my blood freeze. I found her standing by the fireplace, her face pale with fury, holding what looked like a doctor's report in her trembling hands. Dr. Henderson sat in his leather chair, looking like a man facing execution. "Is it true?" Mrs. Henderson's voice was deadly quiet. "Are you carrying my husband's bastard child?" The word bastard hit me like a physical blow, but I straightened my spine and met her gaze. "Yes, ma'am, I am." The admission hung in the air like smoke, poisoning everything it touched. Dr. Henderson finally spoke, his voice hollow. "Margaret, we can handle this discreetly. There are ways to—" But his wife cut him off with a sharp laugh that held no humor. "Handle this? Handle this?" Her voice rose to near hysteria. "Do you think I'm some naive little wife who will quietly clean up your messes? This girl is carrying your child, William. Your child." She turned to me, her eyes blazing with 20 years of suppressed rage. "How long did you think you could hide this? Did you think you could trap my husband with your little bastard? Did you think he would leave me for a servant girl?" I wanted to explain that I had never asked for anything, never expected anything, but the words died in my throat. Mrs. Henderson opened her purse and pulled out a roll of bills. 3 months' wages, she said, throwing the money at my feet. "Get out of my house and never come back. If you ever try to contact my husband or make any claims on this family, I'll make sure you never work in this town again." The money scattered across the Persian rug like autumn leaves, and I knelt to gather it with as much dignity as I could muster. My hands were steady, but inside, I was falling apart. "Doctor," Henderson finally found his voice as I stood to leave. "Rose, if you need anything." But Mrs. Henderson silenced him with a look that could have shattered glass. "She needs nothing from us. Nothing. This conversation never happened. This girl was never here, and that thing she's carrying has nothing to do with this family." Her words were meant to erase me, to make me disappear as if I had never existed. But I existed, and so did the child I carried. I packed my few belongings in a small suitcase, the money from Mrs. Henderson in my coat pocket, along with the $50 Dr. Henderson had left that morning 2 months ago. $150 to start a new life, with a baby on the way. As I walked down Monument Avenue for the last time, carrying everything I owned, and a secret that felt heavier than any suitcase, I made a promise to the child growing inside me. Whatever came next, we would face it together, and I would never let them feel unwanted the way I had been made to feel in that house. The boarding house on Gray Street was a far cry from the Henderson mansion. Mrs. Murphy, the Irish landlady, was a widow who had seen enough of life's hardships to recognize them in others. When I explained my situation, pregnant, unmarried, recently unemployed, she didn't judge or lecture. She simply quoted the weekly rate for a small room on the 3rd floor and asked if I could pay 2 weeks in advance. "Breakfast is included," she said kindly, "and there's a communal kitchen if you want to cook your own meals." My room was barely large enough for a bed and a dresser, with a window that looked out onto the alley behind the house. But it was mine, and for the first time in months, I could breathe without feeling like I was suffocating under the weight of secrets and shame. The other residents were mostly working women, seamstresses, shop girls, a telephone operator named Betty, who became my first real friend. None of them asked too many questions about my circumstances, understanding that we all had reasons for living in rooms instead of homes. Finding work while pregnant proved harder than I had anticipated. The moment potential employers noticed my condition, their expressions would change from interest to polite dismissal. "We'll be in touch," they would say, but the touch never came. It was Betty who suggested the laundry on Broad Street. "Mrs. Chen doesn't care about personal business," she said. "She just wants someone who will work hard and show up on time." The laundry was hot, steamy work. Sorting, washing, pressing clothes, for people who could afford to have their cleaning done elsewhere. Mrs. Chen was a tiny Chinese woman who spoke broken English, but understood the universal language of desperation. She paid me $3 a day, which was enough to cover my room and board, with a little left over for the baby clothes I was slowly accumulating. The work was exhausting, especially as my pregnancy progressed, but it was the honest work, and I was grateful for it. The other women who worked there, mostly immigrants and other women down on their luck, formed an unofficial family that supported each other through hard times. As my belly grew rounder, I crafted the story I would tell my child about their father. He was a construction worker, I decided, who had died in an accident before the baby was born. It was a lie that felt less shameful than the truth, that their father was a respected doctor who had used his position and my naivety for one night of pleasure, and then discarded me like yesterday's newspaper. I practiced telling this story until it felt almost real, until I could recite the details of our fictional romance with tears in my eyes. The pain started on a sweltering July morning when I was hanging laundry on the lines behind Mrs. Chen's shop. At first, I thought it was just the heat making me uncomfortable. But as the contractions grew stronger and closer together, I knew my time had come. Betty had promised to help when the moment arrived, and true to her word, she appeared at the laundry within an hour of Mrs. Chen sending word. "Come on, honey," she said, wrapping her arm around my waist. "Let's get you to the hospital and meet this baby." Richmond General Hospital was not a place for charity cases, but Betty had somehow managed to arrange for a midwife who was willing to help for the money I had saved. The labor was long and difficult, 15 hours of pain that seemed to tear me apart and put me back together again. But when they placed my son in my arms, when I looked into those dark eyes that were unmistakably his father's, all the pain disappeared. He was perfect, beautiful, mine. I named him Michael, after the archangel who protected the innocent. From the moment I held Michael, I knew that everything I had endured had led to this moment. The humiliation, the rejection, the fear, all of it had been worth it to bring this precious life into the world. He had Dr. Henderson's dark hair, his strong jaw, his intelligent eyes, but he was mine to love, mine to raise, mine to protect. As I nursed him for the first time, I whispered promises I intended to keep. I will never let anyone make you feel unwanted. I will work my fingers to the bone to give you a good life, and I will never let you be ashamed of who you are. The challenges of being a single mother in 1965 were immediate and overwhelming. Mrs. Murphy at the boarding house was kind enough to let me keep Michael in my room. But the crying bothered other residents, and I knew I would need to find other arrangements soon. Betty found me a small apartment above a bakery on Church Hill. One room, a hot plate, and a bathroom down the hall that I shared with 2 other tenants. The rent was $15 a month, which left me very little after buying food and baby supplies. Mrs. Chen had kept my job open, bless her heart, but returning to work with a newborn seemed impossible, until another resident of Church Hill offered a solution. Mrs. Washington was an elderly black woman who had raised 8 children of her own and was willing to watch Michael during the day for $1 a week. "Babies need love more than anything else," she told me, and I got plenty of that to spare. Her offer was a godsend, allowing me to return to work and keep food on the table, while knowing my son was in caring hands. Those early months were a blur of sleepless nights, endless worry about money, and the constant fear that I wasn't enough for this tiny person who depended on me completely. There were nights when I cried myself to sleep, overwhelmed by the responsibility and the loneliness. But there were also moments of pure joy. Michael's first smile, his first laugh, the way his eyes lit up when I came to collect him from Mrs. Washington's house each evening. These moments gave me strength to keep going when everything seemed impossible. As Michael grew from infant to toddler, his resemblance to his father became more pronounced. The same dark eyes, the same dimple in his left cheek, the same way of tilting his head when he was thinking. I lived in constant fear that someone from my old life would see us together and recognize the similarities. Richmond wasn't that large a city, and Dr. Henderson was a prominent figure whose face appeared regularly in the society pages of the newspaper. I took different routes through town, avoided the areas where I might encounter the Henderson family, and prayed that our paths would never cross. But Michael was a curious, intelligent child who asked questions about everything. "Mama, why don't I have a daddy like Tommy next door?" he asked one evening when he was 4 years old. I had been dreading this conversation, but I had my story ready. "Your daddy was a good man named Robert," I told him, stroking his dark hair. "He loved us very much, but he had to go to heaven before you were born." The lie came easier each time I told it, but it never stopped feeling like a betrayal of the sweet, trusting child who believed every word I said. Life settled into a routine of sorts. I worked at the laundry during the day, picked up Michael from Mrs. Washington's house each evening, and spent our nights reading library books and playing simple games in our tiny apartment. Money was always tight, but we managed. I learned to stretch a pound of ground beef into 3 meals, to darn socks until they were more thread than original material, to find joy in free entertainments like walks in the park and stories before bedtime. When Michael started school, I began to dream of something more than survival. Mrs. Patterson, who owned the dress shop next to the laundry, had noticed my skill with a needle during the times I had altered clothes for extra money. "Rose," she said one day, "have you ever thought about learning to make dresses? I could use someone with your eye for detail." The offer was part-time at first, just a few hours in the evening after my shift at the laundry, but it felt like a door opening to a different future. Mrs. Patterson taught me everything she knew about dressmaking: how to read patterns, how to fit fabric to a woman's body, how to add the small touches that made a simple dress elegant. I discovered that I had a natural talent for it, an instinct for what would flatter each customer's figure and complexion. Word spread quietly through the neighborhood that Rose at Patterson's could create beautiful dresses at affordable prices, and soon I had more work than I could handle. The extra money from dressmaking allowed me to move Michael and myself into a better apartment, 2 whole rooms, with our own bathroom and a small kitchen. It wasn't luxury, but after years of making do with so little, it felt like a palace. Michael had his own bedroom for the first time, decorated with drawings he made at school and books we borrowed from the library. I was proud of what we had built together, this small but stable life that we had carved out against all odds. As Michael entered his teenage years, his questions about his father became more specific and harder to deflect. What did Daddy look like? Do I look like him? What was his favorite color? Why don't we have any pictures of him? Each question required me to add another thread to the web of lies I had woven, making the story more elaborate but also more fragile. I lived in constant fear that one day the whole thing would unravel, that Michael would somehow discover the truth about his origins. The success of my dressmaking business had grown beyond what I had ever imagined possible. I had saved enough money to rent a small shop on Gray Street, just a few blocks from the boarding house where Michael and I had started our journey together. Rose's Bridal Boutique specialized in wedding dresses, and I had discovered a particular talent for creating gowns that made every bride feel beautiful on her special day. The work was demanding but fulfilling, and it provided us with a comfortable middle-class life that I had never dreamed possible when I was scrubbing floors in the Henderson mansion. Michael was 15 years old, tall and handsome when our carefully constructed world began to shift. He had started asking more pointed questions about his father, no longer satisfied with vague answers about a construction worker who had died before his birth. "Mama," he said one evening as we were closing the shop, "I don't look anything like the construction workers I see around town. And how come we don't have any relatives from Daddy's side of the family?" His questions were logical, reasonable, and impossible to answer, without revealing truths I had spent 15 years hiding. It was a Saturday afternoon in October when fate finally caught up with us. Michael and I were shopping at the new Thalheimer's department store downtown, looking for fabric for a particularly challenging wedding dress order. We were examining bolts of silk in the fabric department when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Excuse me, miss. Could you help me find the pattern books?" I turned around and found myself face to face with Dr. Henderson, now in his 50s, but still unmistakably the man who had changed my life with a single night of passion. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, the years collapsing between us. He looked older, grayer, but still distinguished in his expensive suit and polished shoes. His eyes moved from my face to Michael, who was standing beside me examining a bolt of blue satin, and I watched Dr. Henderson's expression change from surprise to shock to something that might have been recognition. The resemblance between father and son was unmistakable to anyone who knew to look for it. "Rose, Doctor." Henderson's voice was barely a whisper. Is he... He couldn't finish the question, but I saw the answer dawn in his eyes as he took in Michael's features. Features that mirrored his own so perfectly that there could be no doubt about paternity. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone in the store could hear it. 15 years of careful planning, of avoiding certain parts of town, of creating elaborate lies, and it had all been undone by a chance encounter in a department store. Michael looked up from the fabric, curious about the strange man who was staring at him with such intensity. "Mama, do you know this gentleman?" His polite question broke the spell, and I found my voice. "This is Dr. Henderson," I said carefully. "He knew your father." It wasn't entirely a lie, I told myself, though it wasn't entirely the truth either. Dr. Henderson's eyes never left Michael's face, and I could see him cataloging every familiar feature, every genetic echo of himself in this teenager who had no idea he was meeting his biological father. "You have your father's eyes," Dr. Henderson said softly, and I felt my carefully constructed world begin to crumble. Michael smiled, pleased by the observation. "Everyone says that, but I've never seen any pictures of him. He died before I was born." The innocence in his voice, the trust, the complete lack of suspicion, it broke my heart, and Dr. Henderson simultaneously. I could see the regret written across his face, the weight of 15 years of denial and abandonment settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. We made polite conversation for a few more minutes. Doctor Henderson asking Michael about school, about his interests, absorbing every detail about the son he had never known. When we finally said goodbye and went our separate ways, I knew that everything had changed. The secret I had guarded so carefully was no longer entirely mine to keep. Dr. Henderson had seen his son, had spoken to him, had begun to understand what he had given up when he chose his reputation over responsibility all those years ago. That night, as Michael slept peacefully in his room, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and wondering if Dr. Henderson would try to contact us. Part of me hoped he would leave us alone, let us continue the life we had built without his interference. But another part of me, the part that had never stopped loving the man who had been so gentle with me that night so long ago, wondered if perhaps it was time for the truth to finally come out. Michael deserved to know who his father was, and maybe Dr. Henderson deserved a chance to know the remarkable young man his son had become. 3 weeks later, the knock I had been expecting finally came. I was working late at the boutique, putting the finishing touches on a wedding dress that was due the next day, when I heard the soft rap on the shop door. Through the glass, I could see Dr. Henderson's silhouette, and my hands trembled slightly as I set aside my sewing and went to let him in. He looked nervous, uncertain, nothing like the confident physician I remembered from my youth. "Rose," he said as I unlocked the door, "I hope you don't mind me coming here. I've been thinking about our meeting at the store, About Michael. He paused, searching for words. About my son. The admission hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we were ready to cross. I stepped aside to let him into the shop, my sanctuary, the place where I had built my independence and my success. It felt strange to have him here, in this space that represented everything I had accomplished without his help. "What do you want, William?" I asked, using his first name for the first time since that long-ago night. He winced slightly at the familiarity, or perhaps at the directness of my question. "I want to know him," he said simply. "I want to know my son. I want to." He stopped, looking around the boutique with something that might have been pride. "You've done well for yourself, Rose. Better than I ever imagined when Margaret threw you out of our house. You've raised our son to be a fine young man, and you've built all this without any help from anyone. I'm proud of you." His words stirred up emotions I had buried long ago. The memory of the young woman who had believed in fairy tales, who had thought that love could conquer any obstacle. "It's been 15 years, William," I said quietly. 15 years of struggling, of lying to protect your reputation, of raising your son without a father because you were too concerned about what people would think. What's changed? Why now? The questions poured out of me like water from a broken dam, carrying with them all the hurt and resentment I had tried so hard to overcome. Dr. Henderson sat down heavily in one of the chairs I kept for customers, suddenly looking every one of his 53 years. "Margaret died last month," he said quietly. "Cancer. In her final weeks, she talked a lot about regrets, about the choices we made, about the people we hurt. She never forgot that day when she threw you out, Rose. She carried the guilt of it for 15 years, even though she never admitted it to me until the very end." He looked up at me with eyes that held a lifetime of accumulated sorrow. "She made me promise to find you, to find our son, to try to make amends for what we did to you. The news of Margaret Henderson's death should have brought me satisfaction, some sense of justice finally served. Instead, I felt only sadness for a woman who had been as much a victim of her husband's choices as I had been. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said, and I meant it. "But that doesn't change anything between us. Michael has a life, a story about his father that gives him peace. What right do you have to disrupt that now?" Even as I said the words, I knew they weren't entirely true. Michael had been asking harder questions, pushing for details I couldn't provide. The lies were becoming harder to maintain, and maybe it was time for truth, no matter how painful. "I don't want to disrupt anything," Dr. Henderson said earnestly. "I just want a chance to know him, to be part of his life if he'll have me. I want to help with his education, his future. I want to try to be the father I should have been from the beginning." The offer was tempting. Financial security for Michael's college education, opportunities I could never provide on my own. But it also meant admitting to my son that I had lied to him for his entire life, that the father he mourned had never existed. We talked for hours that night, long after the dress shops and restaurants on Gray Street had closed their doors. Dr. Henderson told me about his marriage to Margaret, about the loneliness and regret that had haunted him for 15 years. I told him about the struggles of those early years, about watching Michael grow into a young man any father would be proud to claim. Slowly, carefully, we began to negotiate the terms of truth, how to tell Michael, when to tell him, what role Dr. Henderson would play in his life going forward. "He has a right to know," I finally admitted as dawn began to break over Richmond. "And maybe I'm tired of carrying this secret alone." The decision felt both terrifying and liberating. For 15 years, I had been the sole guardian of the truth about Michael's paternity. Now, for the first time, there would be someone else who shared the burden of that knowledge. Someone else who loved Michael enough to want what was best for him, even if it meant facing uncomfortable truths about the past. "Doctor..." Henderson reached out and took my hand. The first time he had touched me, since that night in 1965. Thank you, Rose, for everything. For raising him. For protecting him. For becoming the strong, remarkable woman you are today. I know I don't deserve this chance, but I promise I won't waste it. His touch brought back memories of the young woman I had been, but also reminded me of the woman I had become. I was no longer the naive 18-year-old who could be swept away by pretty words and gentle touches. I was a mother, a businesswoman, a survivor who had built a life from nothing but determination and love. The conversation with Michael happened on a Sunday afternoon in November. I had spent weeks planning what to say, how to explain 15 years of lies without destroying his faith in me completely. Dr. Henderson waited at his apartment across town while I prepared our son for a truth that would change everything he thought he knew about himself. Michael, I began as we sat together in our small living room. There's something I need to tell you about your father. Something I should have told you long ago. The look on his face when I finished speaking was one I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Hurt, betrayal, confusion, anger, all of it cycling through his dark eyes like storm clouds. You lied to me, he said quietly. For my whole life you lied to me about who I am, where I come from, why I don't have a father. I tried to explain about the shame, about the fear, about wanting to protect him from a truth that would only hurt him. But 15-year-old boys don't always understand the complicated choices adults make, especially when those choices involve years of deception. Does he want to meet me? Michael asked finally, after the tears and the angry words had been exhausted. He's been wanting to meet you for weeks, I told him. But only if you want to meet him too. This is your choice, Michael. Everything from here on out is your choice. It was important to me that he understand he had power in this situation. That he wasn't just a pawn in a game between adults. He was 15 years old enough to make decisions about his own life, his own relationships. The first meeting between Michael and Dr. Henderson took place the following weekend in the neutral territory of Maymont Park. I watched from a distance as father and son sat on a bench beside the Japanese garden, talking quietly. Michael had his father's serious expression when he was thinking, the same way of rubbing his chin when he was considering something important. Dr. Henderson looked nervous but eager, like a man being given a gift he had never expected to receive. They met regularly after that. Dinner once a week, occasional weekend outings, conversations about medicine and science and literature. Dr. Henderson was careful not to overstep his bounds, understanding that he was a guest in Michael's life rather than an automatic authority figure. He offered to pay for college, for music lessons, for all the things I had never been able to afford. But he asked permission first, respecting the bond between Michael and me that no amount of money could replace. The revelation had changed our family dynamic, but not in the ways I had feared. Michael was angry with me for a while, but teenagers are remarkably resilient, and he seemed to understand that my lies had come from love rather than malice. Dr. Henderson was respectful of my role as Michael's primary parent, never trying to undermine my authority or replace me in my son's affections. Instead, he became an addition to our small family unit, rather than a disruption of it. As Michael's senior year of high school approached, Dr. Henderson's health began to fail. The stress of his wife's illness and death, combined with decades of long hours at the hospital, had taken their toll. He suffered a mild heart attack in the spring of 1982, and suddenly the future we had all been cautiously planning seemed uncertain. "I want to see him graduate," he told me during one of our increasingly frequent visits to the hospital. "I want to see him start college, see what kind of man he becomes." Michael's graduation was a milestone for all of us. As I watched my son walk across the stage to receive his diploma, I thought about the scared 18-year-old girl who had once scrubbed floors in Dr. Henderson's house. That girl had dreamed of fairy tale endings, but she had never imagined anything as wonderful as this reality. A son who was kind, intelligent, and strong. A business that provided financial security, and even a cautious friendship with the man who had once broken her heart. Life, I reflected, was often better than fairy tales because it was real. Dr. Henderson's second heart attack came without warning on a Tuesday evening in September. Michael was away at the University of Virginia, where he had earned a scholarship to study pre-medicine. I was working late at the boutique when the call came from the hospital. "Mrs. Martinez," the nurse said, "Dr. Henderson has asked for you. He may not have much time." I closed the shop immediately and drove through the empty streets of Richmond, my heart pounding with the knowledge that the complicated relationship we had built over the past 3 years was about to end. I found him in the cardiac care unit, looking small and frail in the hospital bed. The machines around him beeped steadily, marking out the remainder of his time with mechanical precision. "Rose," he whispered when he saw me. "Thank you for coming. Is Michael?" I had already called the university, and our son was driving through the night to be here. "He's coming," I assured him. "He'll be here soon." We sat in the quiet of the hospital room, two people who had shared a son and a secret, waiting for one last goodbye. Michael arrived just as the sun was rising over Richmond, still wearing the clothes he had thrown on when he got my phone call. The sight of his father, pale, weak, but smiling at the sight of his son, brought tears to his eyes. "Dad," he said, using the word naturally for the first time. "I'm here." Dr. Henderson reached for his hand, and I stepped back to give them privacy for their final conversation. Father and son, united at last, sharing words that were meant for them alone. Dr. Henderson died peacefully 2 hours later, with both Michael and me beside his bed. His last words were an apology, to me for the years of silence, to Michael for the time they had lost, to the memory of his wife for the choices that had brought them all to this moment. As the machines fell silent and the nurses came to perform their final duties, I felt a chapter of my life closing. The young woman who had loved Dr. Henderson, the angry mother who had resented his abandonment, the cautious friend who had learned to forgive. All of these versions of myself were united in grief for a man who had been both the source of my greatest pain and the father of my greatest joy. The funeral was a small affair. Dr. Henderson had left instructions that he wanted only family present, and since he had no other children and no surviving relatives, that meant just Michael and me. We stood beside his grave in Hollywood Cemetery, surrounded by the monuments to Richmond's past, and said goodbye to a man who had shaped both our lives in ways we were still learning to understand. "Thank you," Michael said quietly as we walked back to the car, "for telling me the truth, for bringing him into my life, for everything." His forgiveness was a gift I hadn't known I needed until I received it. In his will, Dr. Henderson left his house on Monument Avenue to Michael, along with enough money to pay for medical school and graduate school and anything else his son might want to pursue. But more importantly, he left letters, dozens of them, written during his final months, addressed to the son he had found too late, and the woman who had raised that son with such grace and strength. I want him to know that every day we lost was my fault, not yours, he had written to me. I want him to know that his mother is the strongest, most remarkable woman I have ever known, and that he should spend his life trying to be worthy of her love. Today, as I sit in my living room in the house that Michael bought for me, when he became a successful doctor himself, I think about the journey that brought us all to this place. The scared 18-year-old who believed in fairy tales grew into a woman who learned that real life is both harder and more beautiful than any story. The lies I told to protect my son eventually gave way to truths that set us all free. The man who broke my heart learned to be a father, even if only for a few short years. Michael is 40 years old now, married to a lovely woman who knows our whole story and loves us both despite our complicated past. They have given me 2 beautiful grandchildren who call me Nana Rose and never think twice about the fact that their grandfather died before they were born. The Henderson name died with Dr. Henderson, but his legacy lives on in the son who became everything his father had hoped he might be: kind, intelligent, dedicated to healing others and making the world a better place. The boutique is still thriving, though I've hired younger seamstresses to do most of the detailed work these days. I still love creating beautiful things for brides on their special day, helping them feel as beautiful as I felt during that one magical night when I believed in fairy tales. The difference is that now I know that real beauty comes not from candlelight and silk dresses, but from the strength to rebuild your life when it falls apart, the courage to tell difficult truths when the time is right, and the wisdom to forgive when forgiveness seems impossible. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through my memories. I hope my story has touched your heart in some way. If you enjoyed hearing about my life, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this video. It really helps us reach more people who might need to hear these stories. Every day we share new tales about life, love, loss, and redemption, so feel free to explore and find your favorite. And please, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What did you think of my story? Did it remind you of anything from your own life? Tell me where you're watching from too. I love knowing that these memories of mine can travel so far and touch so many different hearts. See you tomorrow with another story that I hope will inspire you as much as sharing this one has inspired me.